From the most toe-curling romance to the most terrifying torture scenes, The Outlander has been an absolute emotional roller coaster. But sometimes they push it a bit too far, and that's exactly why these episodes were the worst. Let's start with Wentworth Prison. There's no way in hell that you would have forgotten about the 15th episode from Season 1, because it was unarguably one of the most bone-chilling episodes I have ever seen in my life. Obviously, as soon as they made it clear that Black Jack was going to visit, everybody knew that stuff would be going down. But nobody thought about just how bad things could get for Jamie. Seeing as he was a captive, he was basically helpless. And this man really made the poor guy realize that things could get a lot worse than his death sentence. I mean, I genuinely feel like there wasn't a warning big enough to prepare anyone for what was about to come. Because the way Jack tortured Jamie left everybody shaking in their seats. And that's probably why this episode is one of the lowest rated in the entire series. Don't get me wrong, everybody found the acting commendable, but maybe the fact that they were acting that well made the average audience uncomfortable. In fact, uncomfortable would be a huge understatement because most fans found this episode unwatchable, as the sadism and the graphic content became a bit too much for them. Not to mention, most of them felt that they could get the point across in many different ways. Because if all they wanted was to show Jack as a sick-minded person, they didn't have to overdo it like that. But this isn't the only time they ruined a perfectly good concept. Famous last words. This is the 8th episode of Season 5, and it might have stood out to you, because most fans just found it plain boring. I mean, there wasn't just one complaint. For starters, everybody hated the sepia filter flashbacks, as the entire episode just shows us flashbacks of Roger and his sufferings after the Battle of Alamance. It just became too repetitive. At one point, they just wanted it to end, because that kind of morbid detail only looks good sometimes. Come on, you don't just bombard fans with that much visual detail. And mostly, the fans were super pissed about the long wait they had to endure just to end up with this fail of an episode. What's really interesting is the fact that most of these fans actually love the show and tune in every single time for every season. So it's not like the entire show is disappointing them. It's just that, sometimes, the narrative doesn't go as well as the showrunners might have planned. And most of the fans agreed that this sequence was a lot nicer in the books. To them, the show completely ruined it. In fact, one of them pointed out that they showed Roger hanging at least 10 times, and that they could have brought the episode time down 17 whole minutes if they hadn't been so obsessed with misery. But the show's been pretty persistent in dragging things out, like the next episode on this list, The Search. This was the 14th episode of the first season, and though it had the potential to be one of the greatest episodes of the entire season, it simply flopped. I mean, you got to see Claire and Jenny form the nicest bond with each other, and they both went out to rescue Jamie from his captors, so things could have really picked up here. Instead, it had some pretty off-putting things, like the dance routine that they randomly brought in. Not a single fan would have imagined that they'd have to see Claire doing a rendition of the Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy. Because that stuff was simply way too out of character, and it genuinely made no sense. Obviously, it wasn't even in the books, and it reeked of the Hollywood influence it most probably had in it. So really, it just ruined the vibe of the entire episode. Another fan pointed out how you don't see Sam even once in the episode, even though it was supposed to be all about his big rescue, so all it felt like was a giant distraction from its real purpose. And even if you skipped over this episode while going through the season, you wouldn't miss out on anything important. That's the extent of how dragged the fans felt along with this episode. which explains the sadly low rating. I feel like they really could have saved it, because it's not like they were running out of stories to tell. But straying away from the source material has never served them well. Exactly like the next episode I'm gonna talk about, Down the Rabbit Hole. The 7th episode from Season 4 was all about Brianna, and it follows the journey of her doing exactly what her mother did by traveling through the stones, ending up all the way back in 18th century Scotland. Now, this is where you see her on a troublesome journey to find her parents, but it just didn't sit well with any of the fans. I mean, from the character to the actress who actually played it, nothing about this episode was pleasing. The moment they stepped this far from the books was the moment they should have known that they messed up. Because mostly, it made no sense for Laurie to have this much screen time. Her character just wasn't important enough to be emphasized this much. And instead of going for her, they could have really brought the focus onto the people of Lallybroch. And they could have also made Brianna's plotline a little less annoying. Like, she can never see things without somehow manipulating the narrative. And for some reason, she always finds a way to feel betrayed. It's almost like she doesn't have the ability to admit that she's wrong. And folks, that's exactly why fans tell showrunners to stick to the source material. It's never an easy task to ace an adaptation, but bad writing has ended up costing them entire seasons. And the next episode is the best example I can give you. Sticks and Stones. Bear in mind, this was the 7th episode in Season 6, and the season was practically reaching its end. But instead of managing to bring the show back up after an entire season of lagging, things just kept getting worse. Most of the fans who had been watching the show for years could tell instantly when the vibe was off. I mean, Jamie got accused of rape, and Claire had to be dealing with being called a witch. And while it might seem exciting in theory, this really wasn't why people were watching this show. A lot of them were in it for the romance, not to mention the mystery and the excitement that came along with the events simply made it worthwhile. But unexpectedly, things took a very sharp turn in this episode, and everything became an embarrassing, gothic mess. I mean, could you have imagined the Outlander going down a horror route? Me neither. But the fact that Claire had all this trauma piling up and that she had to deal with all of it on her own was just really sad. Jamie is literally the love of her life, and seeing how their chemistry is what really got people hooked in the first place, it was just painful to see them so distant and helpless. The inaccuracies from the book only made things worse. So, it's safe to say this entire season was a big, fat letdown for die-hard fans. And here you have it, the worst Outlander episodes ranked by the fans.